4, and we're only going to deal with two verses here, verse 4 and verse 13. So that'll be Hebrews chapter 8, verse 4 and 13. Those are two verses that are full of information that we need to discover concerning Jesus, who he was in relation to this modern day concept of tides. Let's read it. Verse 4 says, "For if he were on earth, he should not be a priest, seeing that there are priests that offer gifts according to the law." What do you believe that scripture to mean? What do they mean when they say, for if he were on earth? We know that Jesus was on earth. Jesus lived on earth at one point in time 2,000 years ago. So according to the scripture, when Jesus lived on earth, he was not a priest. It clearly says, if he were on earth, he means Jesus, he should not be a priest. What does that mean? That means what it says. You see, the priests that are spoken of in verse 4 is talking about a particular group of men ordained by God to be priests. There was a particular group of Israelites that were the exclusive priests of God. They were appointed by God, and they alone could only be priests under God's old covenant. Only those men born from the tribe of Levi were priests upon the planet Earth, and nobody not born from the tribe of Levi under the old covenant could be a priest. This is why the scripture says that when Jesus lived on earth more than 2,000 years ago, he was not a priest. For if he were on earth, he should not be a priest, seeing that they were priests that offer gifts according to the law. You see, these priests that were ordained by God, called the Levite priesthood, and the law were imperfect. The priesthood that God ordained to be the priest of God under the old covenant was an imperfect priesthood. According to verse 7 of Hebrews chapter 8, verse 7 says, "For if the first covenant had been faultless, for then should no place have been sought for the second." You see, the priesthood of the first covenant under the law of Moses, as well as the law, was imperfect. For if the first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. The priesthood and the law of Moses under the first covenant, under the old covenant, was imperfect. You see, the concept of tithing was a concept that God commanded under the old covenant only. But those tithes were imperfect, just like the priesthood and the law. The tithes also were imperfect. They were temporary. Yes, we understand was merely a temporary law given until Christ came. And then when Christ came, we were no longer under the law. We were no longer under the Levite priesthood when Christ came, because Christ became the only high priest under the new covenant when he established the new covenant by shedding his blood. You see, the old covenant was a temporary, imperfect covenant. The priesthood was a temporary priesthood. It was merely our schoolmaster, according to Galatians chapter 3. The priesthood was a schoolmaster until Christ came. Then we were no longer, again I say, we were no longer under that imperfect, temporary priesthood and law and covenant. Now, as I stated before, the concept of tithes was also imperfect. With a change in the priesthood came what? A change in the law. With a change in the law and a change in the priesthood came a change in tithes that was commanded by God under the old covenant. You see, tithes are a concept that only applies to the old covenant. Tithing is an old covenant concept that God commanded under the old covenant, and it only applies to the old covenant. Jesus' priesthood is eternal. Unlike the old covenant priesthood, Jesus' priesthood is eternal, not temporary, not imperfect, not at fault. Jesus was prohibited from paying tithes. You see, tithes was something God commanded to be done by a temporary priesthood. Jesus' priesthood was eternal. Where they say, well, Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek. That's what people say. But Melchizedek, like Jesus' priesthood, were both eternal. They were not temporary, imperfect priesthoods that were commanded to be in existence under the law. The law required for temporary tithes to be paid to the priest. But neither Jesus nor Melchizedek's priesthood was a temporary priesthood. Their priesthood was eternal. You see, if you follow the concept that we must pay tithes under the new covenant, you're contradicting and violating what God denied Jesus from doing. You see, Jesus was not a man born from the tribe of Levi. So if he collected tithes and made tithe offerings to God according to the law, he would be violating God's law and God's commandments, because he was not born from the tribe of Levi. That's why it says in verse 4, for if he were on earth, he should not be a priest, because seeing that there are priests that offer gifts according to the law. These priests that offer gifts according to the law, where did they get the gifts from to offer? They got them from the other tribes. You see, the priests and the priesthood did not work. they were provided for by the other 11 tribes of Israel. And when they got these tithe offerings, they took 10% of their tithe offerings and made sacrifice and offerings to God. Jesus nor Melchizedek were commanded to receive tithes from Israel or anybody else, nor did they pay tithes. Tithing is a concept that only pertains to the Levitical priesthood, who received tithes from Israel according to God's commandment. And this priesthood that was created under the law and old covenant was commanded by God to make a offering to God of bulls and goats and herd animals and food grown from the ground. But see, that was a commandment given to only to this Levitical priesthood. It was not a commandment given to anyone else but those ordained by God to be Levitical priests. And to be a Levitical priest, you had to be born from a man who was a Levite. Jesus, again, was born from the tribe of Judah. Jesus lived during the time of the Levitical priesthood under the Old Covenant. You see, Jesus was born under the Old Covenant and lived under the Old Covenant when the Levite priesthood was in effect. And according to the law, Jesus was prohibited from being considered a priest, or he was prohibited from collecting tithes, and he never did collect tithes, nor did his disciples collect tithes after he died. So why would any preacher today say that Jesus collected tithes and that you are following Jesus when you collect a 10% tithe offering from your congregation? Are you following Jesus, or are you following some man-made doctrine? I think it's a man-made doctrine, because clearly the scripture says, and clearly Jesus' practice is totally different. Jesus did not make tithe offerings, nor did he collect tithe offerings. Well, we're gonna cut this short. This is an extemporaneous little discussion I wanted to have concerning this scripture. You know, because if tithes were eternal, if tithes were carried over from the old covenant to the new covenant, if tithes were part of the eternal priesthood, Jesus would have been collecting tithes and making tithe offerings under the new covenant. People say that, well, Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek. Well, what they're saying is that the eternal priesthood was commanded by God to make a carnal offering to God. And if that was true during Melchizedek's time with Abraham, it should remain true with Jesus under the new covenant. And Jesus would have been teaching, and Paul and the disciples would have been teaching the eternal existence, 10% tithe offering. But Jesus nor his disciples ever taught that tithes under the old covenant was an eternal commandment that was given to them by God. With that, I say good night.